Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's the Ukraine War news update for the 31st of August 2023, second part thereof. And today's episode is brought to you by the awesome Bobby Caudle. I meant to thank Bobby Caudle for just such awesome support, and now I'm doing it far more publicly. Thank you, Caudle of the Bobby variety. Awesome, legendary. Right. Okay, let's go to the front line to begin with today, as normal for this second part. And actually, as you look at my map here, thank you, JR, for helping with this. JR did all the updating for this. Just really, really appreciate that. It's interesting that most of the pins here to signify changes to the front line are positive for the Ukrainians. There are a few that appear to be rejigs more than Russian gains in the last 24 hours, or Russian gains that were actually some time ago, but just evidence for that hadn't been found yet or seen. But actually quite positive for the Ukrainians. So as we go to the front line, to the northeast sector, and I'm going to do most of my talking about Robotno, of course. But there are some gains up here. This was Andrew. So these light blue ones are Andrew Perpetua, just in case you don't understand. Red lines are Syriac Maps pro-Russian mapper. Blue lines is Andrew Perpetua pro-Ukrainian mapper. White line is the lines from before the counteroffensive started, the Russian defensive lines. Now, there are gains here for the Ukrainians because there was evidence from Andrew Perpetua. He was saying that there was a thermobaric strike on Ukrainian forces, sort of in this tree line. I think that indicates that the Ukrainian forces are there. The Russians are using thermobaric weapons on the Ukrainians here. Then I'll tell you what, the Russian lines are going to be somewhat further north of that, and the Ukrainians are there and sort of control that, or at most it's contested. So this would indicate that Syriac Maps is, lines for the Russian defensive line being all the way down here are just simply not true. And this then feeds into the idea that in this particular sector, the Russian MOD are over-egging their claims of Russian gains, and it's not quite as bad up there as some people are thinking, although there are spokespeople for the Ukrainian MOD saying actually the Kupiansk Liman direction here needs reinforcing from the Ukrainians, and there are some claims that the Russians are going to be making some attacks, offensive operations up there, major ones. Then we move further down to Svatova. So just to remind you, it's seems so long since we've actually talked in any depth about this sector because it's all been about Zaporizhia. You got Kupiansk to Svatova, and you had this area where the Russians did a counterattack and took sort of 5 or 6 kilometers of land, and then the Ukrainians just hit back and have pushed the Russians back consistently. They've been pushed back further around Novohayarivka here towards Kovalivka, and the Ukrainians are having some success in pushing the Russian forces back there. However, since Andrew Perpetua's done that updating, he's also put in a further update, which we don't have on the map here, concerning Kuzmivka and Novoselivka, where so you've got this railway line that separates these two Novoselivskas up here on higher ground, goes down into Kuzmivka. The Russians pushed back. It took, over the railway line, over the road, and then took most of Novoselivska. Some of it might still be grey zone, but they basically had some success there. And apparently just up here by the railway line, where the Russians had their defensive line in the tree in this forest area, they've actually pushed across the railway line here and are having some success to the north of Novoselivska. So that's not yet on the map, but that was a late update from Andrew Perpetua last night. Right. Okay, moving down south, we have some gains for the Ukrainians in the forest area. I talked to you about this. It's just to indicate this more formally, but I did show you the tweet where Andrew Perpetua is saying that he doesn't usually like moving the lines. He's quite conservative about moving lines in the forest because it's quite difficult to find out. He does a lot of shelling analysis. It's quite difficult to find out where they're shelling in the forest for obvious reasons. There's a lot of tree cover. But nonetheless, he's saying, the Ukrainians are definitely further forward in this area as well, which indicates the Russians have been pushed back, one would assume, at some point. So some gains for the Russians, for the Ukrainians in the Serebryansky forest there too. Right, then we come down to to Bakhmut. And I told you about this yesterday. So this is just some kind of confirmation of the claims from yesterday that the Ukrainians have made gains in the forest area just to the north of the E40 highway, the M03 highway, as it comes into the north of Bakhmut. And there have been several bits of footage. This is where there's that drone footage showing a Ukrainian platoon going one way and a Russian platoon going the other way, and they're only like 10 meters away from each other. They didn't know each other were there, and I think the drone operator contacted the Ukrainians, or at least was able to witness the Ukrainians suddenly finding out that the Russians were just next to them, and then taking them out. And that's, there is activity going on in this forest area quite a lot at the moment, but the Ukrainians are having some success in gaining territory there. Now, more significantly, I think, well, that is significant because that's the case. Like I've said to you before, three areas where ideally, right, the Ukrainians would have loads of troops to be able to do lots of offensive operations. But I do think that they have drawn forces away from Bakhmut and down to the south, which is why it's gone a lot quieter up here. It's not to say they're doing nothing, but I think it's a lot quieter. However, if you were to just be concentrating on taking Bakhmut back and having a big old battle around here, then this whole area to the north is dependent on kind of three areas: as high ground in Dubovo-Vasilivka, along the highway there in Zalizhnyanska, and then Bakivka here. So if the Ukrainians were to have success through Bakivka, they're cut off this road, and that would then pretty much cut off the Russian forces here. And that'd be a real problem. If the Ukrainians had success in Dubovo-Vasilivka and were able to cut the Russians in two, and the same sort of thing, then that would cause an issue for this group of Russians up here. And if they're able to come down the road, then they come in behind the people at Dubovo-Vasilivka and Bakivka, and that causes a problem. So all of these three elements are really important for the Russians to maintain control of these areas, and so it is important that the Ukrainians can have success and come down this road, and therefore be able to flank the Russians in Dubovo-Vasilivka and Bakivka eventually from behind. Anyway, we're going to come on down to some success here for the Russians, as according to Andrew Perpetua. Now, this looks like the area that the Russians were attacking with, they lost quite a lot of equipment in some attacks down near tree lines along here. They lost a whole bunch of mechanized equipment that was hammered by artillery. And they basically, that was all lost there. And there was talk about how that was a really bad attack. It was actually it was a good place to attack, as in they can't attack up the hill in Klishchivka. They can't sort of get there from any other direction. Perhaps, you could think about them coming across here and coming in behind Klishchivka, but really you want to come on the same level as the heights behind Klishchivka. So they came along here, they got absolutely hammered. It appears that they are in control of that, even if they are getting hammered by Ukrainian artillery. So this is an area where the Russians have, I don't know whether that's the understanding they've advanced in the last few days, or that is kind of rejigging to say, yep, they've got control of that because the Ukrainians are hitting that with artillery, which means the Russians are there. So on and so forth. Anyway, Syriac Maps is admitting Ukrainian gains around Klishchivka. And this is the most significant news for me of this whole area. I've told you over the last week that the Ukrainians are having most success between Andriivka and Kurdyamivka. Well, according to Andrew Perpetua, Andriivka is now a contested zone. The Russian defense line has been pushed back behind the railway line as it comes up. This is the railway line on an raised embankment that has north and south of Andriivka tree lines either side. There are dugouts all along here. Now, I said the deep state map moving their line behind the first tree line there the other day was significant because it means that the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back over the embankment, and they are having success in pushing them to the east, and that would be really significant because it's rather like the trench lines around Zaporizhia. If the Ukrainians can break through here, it is just like breaking through the trench line, and then they can come in behind and clear up all the dugouts and whatnot. So all it needs, so something, I think trench lines and barriers like this embankment here are very, very much like they are strong, but they're only as strong as the weakest point where there's a breakthrough. And as soon as there's a breakthrough, you're in trouble. Same with the trenches. As soon as a breakthrough, you can either roll up and down the trenches or come in behind and then, yeah, just get out the trenches, get back to the next line. So you kind of only need to break in one place for it to then be rendered kind of impotent to a degree, right? And I think that's what's happening here. So it's waiting for just that one place for it to be broken, and then you have a breakthrough. And that breakthrough then could render the rest of this defensive line rather meaningless. And then the Russians, sorry, have to get out there and find another line of defense. So there's a talk about this road here going through Odradivka up to Opitne. So that could be the next line. We know they've got quite a lot of equipment lined up along there. So that is really significant. And Andriivka, uh, looks like I said it was really vulnerable. It's likely to be liberated soon. It appears that's where fighting is taking place at the moment. So that is what's happening around there. And I think that is particularly significant. It'd be really interesting to see what happens over the next few days there. And then this is interesting, well, because this is gains for the Ukrainians, as according to Suryat maps and to deep state maps. So there is, more gains for the Ukrainians across the canal. So if you remember, and the canal still is for this southern area, the kind of front line, if you like, or the Russian defensive line, until you get to sort of Kurdyivka. But it used to go all the way up here, and the Ukrainians have been able to flush out the Russians from from areas to the east of the canal, right back to the railway embankment. Well, actually, down here, they are having some success south of Ozarianivka in flushing the Russians back eastwards as well. So that, I think, is significant. That's right at the end of my deep state map lines there. But so that could also be significant, as the Ukrainians could then use that to come up from Ozarianivka from the south, to come up to Ozarianivka from the south, and then put more pressure on Kurdyivka from another direction. Anyway, let's go on. I'm spending far too long, aren't I? Some Ukrainian gains just north of Avdiivka, as I talked about yesterday. I said the Ukrainians, Andrew Perpetua was talking about how Novobakhmativka could be quite vulnerable to Ukrainian advances. It's not so well defended as some of these other places. So we are seeing some advances for Ukrainians there. And indeed around Novelska, which is this important place that's tiny, really, but very well fortified in terms of entrenchments and tree lines and whatnot. And it stops Pervomaisky being flanked. And Pervomaisky is important because it stops Avdiivka being flanked, and Severny too. So all these kind of small, you might think are potentially insignificant places, are actually really important. For the Ukrainians to have some gains near Novelska is really good for the Ukrainians going forward, because it gives them that extra buffer zone. It means it's more difficult for the Russians there. Right, Andrew Perpetua is talking about some claims about Mariinka, that there is. If we go to the front line here, if I can find where he is, Andrew Perpetua, he talks about Mariinka, a claim there being a little bit funky. So the label on this video is, in my opinion, wrong, but it claims it's a Russian airstrike on a Ukrainian ammo cache. He says if that's the case, then it's well behind the Russian lines to the south of Mariinka. So it could be that the Ukrainians are actually much further forward here, or it could just be an incorrectly labeled video, and it could be the Ukrainians striking a Russian ammo cache there, which would make more sense, but that's not what the video claims. So it could be the Ukrainians advance there, or it could not be. Right, okay, we're going to come all the way past Velika Novosilka. Not too much to make of this area. That whole area of Russian control might well be a flat line now, as we talked about at some depth yesterday. Russian gains, according to Andrew Perpetua, just in that tree line there. He's just said that actually that was probably taken a good week ago now. So he's just rejigging his map for that. That's not to say that they took that land yesterday. And then it's all about Robotna down here, where it appears the Ukrainians have broken possibly the first and second lines of defense. Depends how you define those kind of lines of defense. We look at Poulet-Volon's map. We have the Russian line being pushed back into Verbove, that you have the tank ditch here that's been breached, and you've got the manned trench line possibly being interpreted as a second line of defense rather than this all being one line of defense and then a second set of trenches behind that. Anyway, Tendar says Ukrainian forces visually confirmed to have broken through the primary Russian defense line west of Verbove. In addition, another Ukrainian deep strike force operates east of Novoprokopivka. That's this settlement there, and they're forcing their way south, which is east of Novoprokopivka, and also into Verbove and down the kind of trench lines. Here we have the armed forces of Ukraine were able to break through the Surovikin line. And battles are already underway on the outskirts of Verbove. That is, Dragon's Teeth restrained the Ukrainian soldiers for only about a day. This is, people were dismissing Dragon's Teeth. I was saying there are something to worry about, but once you do break through them, it's just like I was saying with the embankment. Once you break through them, you've broken through them, and as long as you can maintain that breach, then you can get your equipment through that and bring them in behind the Russian defenses elsewhere. So here we have. Oh no, that's in Donetsk and Andriivka. So that is the claim that I was just talking about back up in Andriivka. Encirclement of Andriivka will begin soon. So very much a grey zone, they say. Capture and position along the railway to the south of there. Anyway, going back to Zaporizhia, we have, after the breakthrough of the defense line of the Russian forces, day after day, messages from the Russians began, which cannot help but warm the soul, says Getty. Footage has appeared, it's claimed, as strikes on the positions of the Ukrainians on the southeastern part of the village of Verbove. There are two options here. Either the Russians are lying or the armed forces of Ukraine control almost the entire settlement. So there are these different claims about how, actually, if we go to Poulet-Vallon's map here, how, if the Russians are striking Ukrainians in different sort of places around here, then actually the Ukrainians control much more of Verbove than many are giving them credit for. Today, Ukrainian shelling Verbove, also two Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters in the skies above Verbove. So this is, it's a serious place. The Russians are bringing in some of their, high value pieces of kit to help defend Verbove. Obviously, you want manpads around there for sure. And then some of this footage, Status 6 says, this video shared by the channel affiliated with the Russian 7th GAAD shows battles around the settlement of Verbove. The most interesting part, however, is a mention of Russian grad strikes in the original video description. As the geolocation shows, if those clouds of smoke seen in the video indeed come from Russian shelling with Grad, that would indicate that the Ukrainians already advanced into the eastern part of Verbove, making significant progress in that sector. In other words, there are Russian claims of Russian Grad strikes and smoke coming up from here. Well, that means the Ukrainians have advanced all the way through most of the village of Verbove, which is really, really significant. David D says the 1429th Mobilized Regiment is so screwed. So these are one of the guys defending outside of Verbove to the west of Verbove. Ukraine looks to be moving forward from reports. And he says, well, this is this one I talk about? Yeah, so this is one that Trent Telenko then dips into as well. I hope we will see this, but I'm not counting on it. This war has shown time again that things take longer and cost more. But talking about 1429th, the Russian doesn't move. If Russia doesn't move to reinforce the 1429th and the three bars, so there's a reserve units, Ukrainian 82nd and 46th brigades could tear a hole and there's nothing behind. The Russian rear command unit, logistics, artillery, air defense are screwed, and Tokmak and the sea become possible. The Russian second and third lines have no one in them. This is what I've been talking about. Like, this is the most positive view of what's going on, of course. But if the Ukrainians are really here in Verbove and they really have breached the defense lines in a number of places, the question is always, well, okay, so you've got lots of Russian troops around here, but then what have you got back here in Ocherud-Tuvate, where you've got the second defensive line there? And if there's nothing, if they don't have the troops, then, well, you could see a really significant, breakthrough that's far greater than just a breakthrough here and allowing you to take Verbove. It could be a much larger breakthrough, and you could see the Ukrainians in this kind of deep battle tactic, probe and probe, find a weakness, and when you get that weakness, you exploit it and throw everything into it. I mean, it's kind of Russian-Soviet war doctrine, but you throw everything into that and you exploit here, and then suddenly all of this area becomes a really big hot mess. So anyway, lots more to talk about in my larger Frontline update later, but that's kind of what's going on. So onto military aid. I've spoken for too long, haven't I, really? Goodness. Military aid. Okay. Germany has provided a new military aid package. They are really coming up trumps at the moment, which includes 10 Leopard 1A5, so some more Leopard 1s being thrown into the mix, one TRML ML 4D radar, so high value radar system, 16 vector reconnaissance drones, 4 HX-81 tank transporters, and more than 13 million small arms pieces of ammunition. Ammunition for Leopard 1, 18 Leopard 2 A6 main battle tanks with ammunition. Uh, I don't. I mean, that's not mentioned up here. Is that what they are giving? Is that what they've totally given? That's not extra one. So I don't know if this is added pieces of kit. It's a bit confusing trying to work that out. There's possibly a load more Mardas being given as well. But again, if there's if those are 40 that have already been given, or those 40 more, so on and so forth. So just trying to work out what that means. But it could be really significant. Right. About 5 to 6 models of drones, says the New York Times, with a flight range of more than 1,000 kilometers are being developed in Ukraine. This is the Beaver drone there. I've talked a lot about how it's really important that Ukrainians develop indigenous tech and equipment, that they get a viable manufacturing industry going in Ukraine, or at least with partners. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, so that they can produce these themselves. They're not relying on Western military aid that also has stipulations you can't use these to attack X, Y, and Z. Well, actually, if you're making them themselves, yes, you can. A brand new Ukrainian armored combat vehicle, the Kozak 2M1, with a remote controlled machine gun turret, appeared near the front line. Even during the war, Ukraine continues to produce and improve its own combat vehicles. This vehicle was created for airborne brigades and special operations forces. I should. That was a cheap trick, Twitter. A cheap trick. Anyway, as you can see, automated, remote control gun on top. That looks pretty cool. I mean, it certainly looks pretty cool. Hopefully, that's a viable machine that can be used, but more importantly, constructed and therefore used. So anyway, more than 1,000 drones and 30 Ukrainian-made robotic systems are being sent to the front, says the Minister of Digitalization, including 25 combat turrets with remote control Shablia, 5 ground platforms, these Lynx ground platforms, and then 900 first-person view drones and more than 100 Mavic and Matrix drones. So not just flying drones, but you've got it looks like remote controlled sort of guns, a la Aliens 2 turrets that fire at the not Aliens 2, Aliens the film, where they have those remote turrets that are firing at the aliens as they attack. I mean, that's where we're at now, and it looks like Ukraine have got them. Hashtag greatest action film ever made. Tim White says President Zelensky today has welcomed Charles Woodburn and colleagues to Kyiv. Now, these guys are behind the curve. I think Rheinmetall are ahead of it, so the German military industrial concern. However, these are chaps from BAE Systems, the British defence giant, which has an American arm and does an awful lot of manufacturing of significant weaponry. They are opening an office in Ukraine. BAE manufactures the L119 and the M777 artillery, as well as the CV90 armored vehicles used by Ukraine, the Swedish ones. On the similar kind of subject, Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov is likely to soon be dismissed following that procurement scandal that went on last year. And that's still being hanging over him. And some people would thought he would be dismissed back then. But I think he's just basically too useful, a bit too good at his job. But anyway, I think he's going to be moved to be an ambassador to the UK. Reznikov will leave the post of Minister of Defence and subsequently go as an ambassador to the UK. The head of the State Property Fund, Rustem Umerov, will be nominated for the position of Minister of Defence. So that is a significant move. Putin and Kim Jong-un prepare to sign a munitions deal, according to CNN. Negotiations between Russia and North Korea are moving forward and are leading to a possible agreement to supply the Russian army with a significant amount of ammunition, including artillery shells. And the White House, according to John Kirby, plans to introduce new sanctions against Russia and North Korea in response to increasing military technical cooperation between the countries. So that is that. Moving on to geopolitical topics now, we go to the Pope. The Pope has incurred the wrath of many Ukrainians and pro-Ukrainians. This has not been a good move. Ukraine blasts Pope Francis' address to Russian youth as imperialist propaganda. So, the pontiff made a video address to the 10th All-Russian Catholic Youth Assembly in St. Petersburg on Friday, during which he urged them to view themselves as descendants of the Russian Empire. Never forget your heritage, he says. You are the descendants of great Russia, the great Russia of saints, rulers, the Russia of Peter I, Catherine II, that empire, educated, great culture, and great humanity. Never give up on this heritage, the Pope said. You are descendants of the great mother Russia. Step forward with it. And thank you for your way of being Russian. Holy cow. Like, if you're being totally charitable, you would say, you are those kind of people, that historical Russia, go and step forward, but he's saying step forward with it, as if this is what it is at the moment as well. Go with it, rather than you are those people. Go kind of, this is a sneaky way of saying go against the kind of Putin imperialism. But I don't think you can read it in that way. I think this is just, or I don't know what his intentions were, but it's come across really badly. I mean, this is just bad. On Monday, Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko lambasted the Pope's speech. Quote, this is a kind of imperialist propaganda, spiritual bonds and the need to save great mother Russia, which the Kremlin uses to justify the murder of thousands of Ukrainians and the destruction of hundreds of Ukrainian towns and villages, Nikolenko said in a Facebook post. The Pope's mission should be precisely to open the eyes of Russian youth to the devastating course of the current Russian leadership, and instead he is promoting Russian great power ideas that are, in fact, the reason for Russians' chronic aggression. So, I mean, morally speaking, he should have said, you are great moral human beings and the Catholic tradition, something like that, and then say, and by the way, your leaders are nuts, don't do that, and don't support it. Of course, that would be hugely controversial, and the Kremlin would completely lambast the Catholic Church, right, the Vatican. So he obviously can't do that because he's thinking about, like, messaging and whatever, the real politic involved in this. But they've ended up basically supporting Russian imperialism, and it is hugely controversial. So for all you Catholics out there, be interested to see what you think about this. Argentinian Pope born Pope continues to cause problems for the Vatican, says Tim White, with emissaries having to go around and sweep up after his message. So Lithuania has summoned the Vatican's top diplomat to the country after Pope Francis told Russian youth to remember that they are heirs to the great Russian Empire and extolled Russian emperors Peter the Great and Catherine II. Like, why this is particularly bad is this is exactly what Putin does. So he's a massive fan of going back into Russian history and extolling the virtues of Peter I and Catherine the Great and using that to defend what he is doing now. He did this before the war. He did this in, like, his approach to Ukraine in general when he wrote that big essay about Ukraine that kind of lays out exactly what he really feels. And if you're going to just go back to those same people that Putin is using to, and if Putin's using them to defend imperialistic tendencies, then all you are doing is invoking the same kind of defense of Russia's current actions. It's just really bad from the Pope here. Just, yeah. Okay, moving on. RFE and RL say Indian businesses are coming under sanctions for the first time due to the war in Ukraine. The Indian government has asked the US to release $26 million belonging to the Indian diamond companies after these assets were frozen due to ties with the sanctioned Russian company. Well, get over it. Don't do work with the Russian companies. You can't, like, that's like me. I know it's like the claim here is that maybe that the US are overstretching and being kind of world police, but no, this is all about strategizing. But there's kind of analogies to me, like, going to my local shop, stealing a bunch of stuff and getting put up in getting taken to the police station, and then my parents demanding from the police station that I be released. I demand that you released release Jonathan MS Pierce because because you should. It's like, well, yeah, okay, we're releasing. If he gives back all he's stolen, and then does some time for the crime he's done, type thing. You can't just those sanctions are in place. Now, what you might have is then India starting to flex its muscles and say, okay, well, if you're going to sanction these companies, we're going to do this to American companies. And you start having a bit of a trade war. And India are in BRICS, and so they're going to side potentially with Russia and China. So this then could develop into something, a lot more serious. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. Right, Tucker Carlson. Oosh. Sorry to mention him again. Orban, in an interview with pro-Russian speaking Dole Tucker Carlson, made threatening language about possible attacks or sabotage on the gas pipeline to Russia in the south of Europe. According to him, Budapest and Belgrade will react immediately if what happened to Nord Stream happens to South Stream. Probably you can do it with the Germans, but not to this region, he added. Why? Look, Tucker Carlson, RT here showing Tucker Carlson's interview. This is who he's in bed with at the moment. He's just well into the pro-Russian, and look at him laugh. And why has he gone to Serbia to do videos with the Serbian diplomats? Why is he interviewing Viktor Orban? Why is his dad? Oh no, his dad is lobbying for the Hungarians, so that's probably why. Why not go to the Poles as conservative Europeans who are against Russia? Why is he positioning himself like follow the money, follow the money? Okay, big news is that Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, has officially now resigned. We knew that it was going to happen. It's just waiting that out. Rishi Sunak is expected to announce a new Defence Secretary to replace Ben Wallace on Thursday, according to government insiders. Grant Shapps, the Energy Security Secretary, is a surprise front runner. Well, I think he is, in fact, that now. So Grant Shapps will become the new British Secretary of Defence, reports Sky News. He is currently serving as Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero since February 2023. Well, he has had this, I think this is his sixth position in a year. I'm not a fan of Grant Shapps, right? I mean, he got into trouble as an MP for having a fake name. Is it Michael Green or something like that? Where he was a multi-million-dollar marketing. He had a multi-million-dollar marketing company on the side as an MP and not declaring that kind of like and having a fake name. And then he had these two personas and was a multi-million-dollar marketeer on the side. It's like not a big fan. So I'm not a huge fan of Grant Shapps. I think he's duplicitous, and he did he not also hire people to change Wikipedia, or he changed Wikipedia himself? Anyway, some memories of mine going back many years now. Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of him. Ben Wallace was really competent, and I think is a huge loss, and it's a huge loss to Ukraine. Ben Wallace was a massive advocate for Ukraine in the government. I'm not saying Grant Shapps won't be, and he might be really pro-Ukrainian, but I just don't think he'll be as competent. He's not got the military experience that Ben Wallace has. It's just a sad loss for the UK government, and therefore a bit of a loss for Ukraine. Grant Shapps may end up being really good, but I'm not a big fan of his. Yeah. Okay, Xi Jinping may skip the G20 summit in India, which we already know Putin is skipping. Now, I wonder whether he's a bit ill. So he skipped quite a bit of the BRICS stuff. Rumors that he was ill for that. So I don't know if this is a health thing or why he would skip the G20 summit, but he is, and make of that what you will. And then finally, Kuleba, who is the foreign minister for Ukraine, is in Spain for meeting EU foreign ministers. So even if Zelensky isn't out and about doing his stuff, he's got really competent other diplomats like the foreign minister, or politicians like his foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who I think is really useful. So he's going around and meeting other foreign ministers and touring 3 European countries as well. So that's really useful. Spain is hosting an informal meeting of EU foreign affairs ministers in Toledo today. The peace formula proposed by Ukrainian President Zelensky is among the items on the meeting's agenda. Again, this is really important for spreading the influence for spreading the Ukrainian narrative to people who are super important in decision making within the EU. So that's really good. Anyway, that's me done for the